Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I offer the following amendment, waive its reading, move its immediate adoption, and request the opportunity to briefly explain it. This amendment restores $90 million to the state share of Medicaid expenses paid to non-for-profits for services rendered to the developmentally disabled. Mr. Speaker, when we come to Albany, we have an obligation to provide a voice to those who would otherwise be silent, an obligation to represent those who physically can't make their voices heard in the voting booth, an obligation to do what's right. OPWDD is responsible for the care of over 126,000 New Yorkers with developmental disabilities. 80% of these services are provided by over 700 nonprofit agencies. In my home county, AHRC Nassau provides care for 2,200 people with these disabilities. In recent years, these providers have already seen over $350 million in cuts, and despite this, have worked tirelessly with whatever provided by the state and federal matching funds. In this year's budget, we are proposing a $90 million cut in state aid to nonprofit providers of care to the developmentally disabled. When taking the federal matching funds into account, this becomes a $180 million cut. That's $180 million less to ensure the safety and well-being of those with autism, with cerebral palsy, and Down syndrome. This is unconscionable. As lawmakers, our job is to be the voice of our residents here in Albany, especially for those whose voice would otherwise go silent. We cannot pass a budget leaving our disabled and their caregivers in the lurch. That is why I'm presenting an amendment today on behalf of the Minority Conference, fully restoring aid to the developmentally disabled and to OPWDD's nonprofit providers, and ensuring our government's obligation is met. Our failure to pass this amendment and reinstate this aid will cause many caregivers to close their doors. On Long Island alone, 4 residential homes will be forced to close, and countless other providers will be forced to substantially decrease the quality of their service. A failure to pass this amendment and instead allow our developmentally disabled to see a reduction in services would border on the brink of malfeasance on the part of our state government and, quite frankly, upon this legislature. While the budget presented to us for our consideration today provides many good and necessary programs and initiatives, our priority must be for caring for the most vulnerable in our society. I don't want to see the doors closed on any nonprofit providers, and I'm certain all of you here today don't want our developmentally disabled to go without the attention and support they need. I believe every person in this chamber, as well as in the Senate, agrees we could find $90 million in this $135 billion plan, 0.6% of 1% of the entire budget, to ensure our developmentally disabled receive the funding they need and deserve. One potential source of financing for the restoration is the 5% cut to Medicaid optional services proposed by the Senate in their one-house bill. This 5% cut would be under the Department of Health Medicaid cap and would create an opportunity to transfer more Medicaid funds to developmental disabilities through the Mental Hygiene Stabilization Fund. A 5% cut to optional services would save $2 million per year. Even a 2.5% cut would save the $100 million necessary to restore the $90 million to OPWDD. Therefore, I implore each and every one of you to pass this amendment. And finally, this amendment complies in all respects to the legal requirements as set forth by the New York State Court of Appeals in the decision of Silver versus Pataki in New York State Constitution, Article 7, Section 4. In that, the legislation may add items of appropriation provided that such additions are stated separately and distinctly from the original items of the bill and refer to each to a single object or purpose. We have done exactly that in this amendment by adding the additional $90 million in a separately stated item of appropriation and refers to a single purpose. The governor has the ability to veto this if it is added. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just as a follow-up, please. As far as not offering solutions, as the majority leader pointed out, and I'm not really concerned about the other amendments. We're not considering them at this point, and you could do what's needed to be done at that time. But on this particular amendment, in my offering of it, I offered a monetary solution, and many of my colleagues have offered monetary solutions to fix this amendment. And it's been said that this is a negotiated budget. Well, first of all, I believe that in such a severe matter as the health and welfare of our disabled is our legal and moral obligation. This is not something that you negotiate away so we could give money to Hollywood, we could give money to a football team, we could give money to people who are making $300,000 a year in an election year. That's not what you negotiate away when you take away from these people. This is an absolute. Their monetary expense should be allocated first in the budget, then you can negotiate everything else later. But this is a legal and moral obligation we have. And when you talk about the negotiations, that this was a negotiated budget, with all due respect, my colleagues, we were not part of the negotiation. Had we been there to be part of the negotiation, we would offer you these recommendations and solutions. This is what happens when the majorities and the governor get together and exclude the minorities of both houses. You don't get everybody's ideas. So we could use all this fancy talk, which we use every time an amendment comes to the floor. We're putting a hole in the budget. It's been negotiated. It's been this. It's been that. Not on this subject matter. You don't negotiate it. And not when you exclude numerous members of the House from these negotiations. And as was pointed out before, just so everybody's clear on legality, it's a separate line item. The $30 million is not in jeopardy. It's a separate line item. If you pass this amendment, the governor has the option to veto it, and if this House so chooses after that, we could override the veto. But if the governor wants to adopt this cut, let him own it, let him veto it. Thank you.